All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome to Tim, who's waving. And welcome to the people online as well. So just a little bit of housekeeping for those who are joining us online. If you could leave any questions to the end and then just raise your hand, and the people in the audience obviously can just wave their hand as well. So it's good to see so many of you here for our annual Open Science seminar. So just for those of you who have not been here before for one of these seminars, we host one every year dedicated to an excellent speaker in open science, or someone who's using open science initiatives in their work, or who's kind of been setting up new initiatives. So for those of you who are not familiar with open science, it's kind of an umbrella term for several different practices to make research or science as open and transparent as possible. So it's a real privilege today to have Dr. Priya Silverstein here. I think it's our first external speaker back in person. And I think you told me it's also your first talk back in person. So it's really exciting to combine the two today. So Priya did a PhD at Lancaster University on the topic of language, sorry, not language. I was just going to say language, sorry.
Language
development in children. I wanted to be about language, but development, infant development. She's going to say a little bit about that and how she implemented open research in her actual PhD work. She then kind of, I won't tell her whole story because she'll do it a lot better, but she then moved on to a postdoc and then actually ended up working in a couple of really exciting initiatives outside of academia. She's currently affiliated with the Institute for Globally Distributed Open Research and Education. Yes, got that right. But she's also doing, for example, a research scientist position with the Center for Open Science. And she's going to start a new position in January. That's actually the Psychological Science Accelerator that we heard about last year in the previous Open Science seminar. So it's all kind of coming together really nicely. So as I said, you'll be doing a much better job talking about all of this. So thank you so much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm so excited. Bear with me for my first in-person talk. Humans are scary. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking very self-centered talk just about my entire journey with open science. So it won't be kind of like a normal research talk. There is research in there, but yeah, hopefully a bit of something for everyone, and just kind of an example of like one of the infinite trajectories that people can take kind of PhD onwards. So we can start with who am I? So I'm Priya. My pronouns are they or she. I prefer they. As you said, as Angela said, I'm currently working for the Center for Open Science as a research scientist, and also as a community manager for the Journal Editors Discussion Interface. So I'll explain a bit more about both of those later. But the real question is, how did I get here? So we'll be going through a whistle-stop tour, so hold on to your hats. And as you may have realized, this is Alice in Wonderland themed. So hopefully at least one person will get the references. If not, I will try to explain them. So when talking about open science, like, people have kind of infinite definitions for what this means. I really love this open scholarship umbrella. So this basically kind of talks about like lots of different things that could be included under open scholarship. So the things that you might think of when you think of open science, like open data, open access maybe, but also things that you might not have thought of, like equity, diversity and inclusion, things like that. So I kind of will be talking about a bit of all of this. And also I'm going to be kind of noting with these nice Center for Open Science badges where studies that I'm talking about were pre-registered, or where we have open data and open materials. Also, I put like a little link to the slides at the bottom because there's lots of exciting links. Maybe we could get them sent out afterwards as well for anyone who's interested, because there's quite a few handy resources. So just to kind of give you a picture of what the talk's going to be like, because I'm going to cover a lot. I'm kind of just going to be talking chronologically. So I'll be starting with my PhD, which was at Lancaster University. So I started my PhD looking at infant understanding of communicative cues. So what I mean by communicative cues is things like direct eye contact, referential gaze towards objects, infant-directed speech, so like that weird sing-songy voice that we use when we talk to babies, things like that. So like, do babies understand what these things mean? If so, how do they understand these things? Was the kind of questions I was looking at. But kind of parallel to this, I was also like just starting to learn about open science and get terrified / excited. So this Lancaster University luckily had this open science working group called Prosper, promoting open science practices. And so this is where I started to learn about the replication crisis and kind of become a little bit terrified, because I was like a new PhD student, not kind of knowing where to take my work and feeling like I couldn't rely on the research that had been published already to necessarily like kind of just build on something, because I wasn't sure if any of it was even true in the first place. So I was kind of just like terrified and not knowing where to start. So I thought, well, if I'm so scared, maybe a good place to start is a quick replication, because if I'm kind of not sure whether this, you know, this specific area might be something that I want to pursue, or this paradigm might be something that I want to like make some changes to, maybe first I should start with just replicating a study that I'm interested in, and then once I'm able to replicate it, then I can do all of these exciting extension studies that I have planned. You can probably see where this is going. So the study that I was interested in was this cool study by Yoon and colleagues, where they basically showed that in the presence of these communicative cues that I was talking about, so like things like direct eye contact, infant-directed speech and stuff like that, when infants watched scenes where these cues were present, they had a better memory of the objects that had been interacted with in the scenes than they did if those cues weren't there. And this was kind of important for reasons that I can't get into because of all the million things I want to get into in this talk, but feel free to ask in the Q&A. But it was a cool study and I liked it, and I thought, let's replicate it. So the first replication we did based on the paper, and, you know, as expected, didn't replicate. Not as expected at the time, as expected from how I've set this up. But then kind of we wanted to know why. So we contacted the original authors and we said, like, look, here's our stimuli. Like, why do you think that maybe we weren't able to replicate? And they were like, oh, well, it's because you've like done things completely differently to how we did them. You've done this part of the scene for way too long, and you haven't done this other thing, and blah, blah, blah. And basically it came to light that in the paper there were some mistakes in terms of like how they'd written what the stimuli were like, how long different things were presented, which makes a massive difference in infant studies, because, you know, babies just don't want to be sitting there and doing your study. So it's kind of a big deal if you're going to make them sit there for 10 seconds versus 5 seconds for every trial. So essentially a combination of misunderstandings due to like lack of clarity in the original paper, but also some active mistakes in the writing of the original paper, meant that we'd constructed our stimuli differently to the original. So then we said, okay, fine. With that in mind, like, let's change the stimuli. And we sent it to the original authors and we said, we've seen yours, now you've seen ours. Like, do you think this is a good faith replication of the original study? And basically, would you, if now it doesn't replicate, would you like say that that's like a true non-replication rather than just like a mistake? And they said yes. So we did that. Still no, unfortunately. So we now had these kind of 2 failed replications and didn't really know what to do with them. So luckily, I just kind of, there was a very like well-timed special issue that was on open science in infancy research. So I submitted both replications just as experiment 1 and experiment 2 to that, and was able to publish it. So I was really happy with that. But yeah, definitely learned a lot about conducting replications and kind of, how papers themselves do often, most of the time, do not contain enough information to conduct a good faith replication study. And also was very happy that I kind of pre-registered and had open everything, because the reviewers really liked that, and kind of, I think that made it a lot easier to publish, even though we had no results. So then in year 2, I was like, okay, no more replications, let's do something exciting. So me and my PhD mate, Marina Bajhaidai, we were reading a paper in Journal Club by Vredenberg and colleagues, where they basically found that these same communicative cues that I was talking about, so now moving on from learning but going on to teaching, so when infants had learned how to do something new on a weird toy like these ones that we made in a very makeshift manner, that looked like they could be from Alice in Wonderland. So when infants were taught how to do something on those new toys, if they were taught in the presence of these cues, communicative cues, then they were more likely to later teach that action to an adult, a new adult who'd never seen the toys before, than an action that they hadn't been taught with the presence of these cues, but had just like seen incidentally be interacted with, and by mistake, the action had kind of happened. So they were more likely to transmit these functions if they had been taught to them communicatively. And we thought this was cool, but we were interested in kind of why. So we thought, because we're mean, what about if we just make it really hard for the toddlers? So we basically said, if you pitch it, so before they'd been comparing an action that had been taught communicatively versus an action that had been taught not communicatively, but they were like equally matched for difficulty. But we were like, well, what if we make the one that's been taught to them really hard? Because then if they still preferentially transmit that one to an adult, then that is really because they like are paying attention to the fact that this has been taught to them in a communicative way versus just like something else. So that's what we did basically. We just made it really hard for the communicative condition to win. And lo and behold, kids would rather transmit the easy thing, which we were not very surprised by. But then the thing is that then that kind of brought up an interesting question, which was like, okay, so why? Like, do we, and this is a question that I think like a lot of people come across, is like, do we now interpret these results in combination with the previously published results and come up with some sort of like interpretation that takes both of those into account? Or do we like not take for granted the previous results because we're not sure whether they're real either? So then, to my dismay, we needed a replication of the original study, really. So, you know, I wasn't trying to do another replication, but it kind of just happened. And we weren't able to replicate this. So basically, it wasn't that we could interpret these results in combination with the original study. It was that all we'd kind of learned from this was that kids want to do the easy thing. When it's matched in our replication where it was matched for easiness, we found absolutely no difference between the two conditions. It was like I should have actually put the graph here. It was like the most beautifully null result ever. So yeah, so that was kind of another lesson learned in the fact that like a lot of the ways that we write papers is often like, okay, so now let's situate our results in the literature. But like, how are you meant to do that if you don't know whether the things that you're situating it in can replicate? So yeah. And this was also, so you can see that there's not a pre-reg badge here, which made life so difficult with writing up. I'm not sure if anyone has that same experience of like writing up, especially in like more collaborative teams, where you all kind of have different ways of interpreting the results and you all have different memories of what you decided in meetings where you didn't take enough notes on what it would mean if X, Y, or Z. So that was not a fun process. And so, yeah, I definitely regretted not pre-registering that one. So then in year 3, I was like, I am not doing another replication. Like, no, let's do something completely different. Let's do something that's not based on like some paradigm that someone else had. Let's just like try and think of something new. And so what we did was I read this really cool paper. It was a robotics paper, and it was basically showing that a robot could learn to follow gaze, so to look where someone else was looking, purely through reinforcement learning without having any kind of understanding of communication or like what communication means. And so that was like in contrast to the studies that I'd been trying to replicate and failing to replicate that were kind of saying the opposite, where they were saying, you know, communication is super important and infants are sensitive to these cues because they understand that they're being communicated to, etc. And this was like the other side of the extreme. So it was like you can tell a robot nothing and it will just learn how to follow gaze just through reinforcement learning. But the robot showed this really interesting behavior where basically it learned to follow first in the horizontal plane before it learned to follow in the vertical plane. And this was like the authors had suggested was because of the like more variability in the horizontal plane in the input it was getting. But yeah, it's something that would also be the same or arguably be the same for infants when they're learning. And so basically we wanted to know, do babies do this too? So we designed an eye tracking study. And we tested 9-month-olds, 12-month-olds, and 18-month-olds, basically looking at whether babies show the same pattern. Do babies learn to follow gaze horizontally before they learn to follow gaze vertically? And this is, a photograph from me testing the babies. So you can see me over here, and then the kind of angry parent, as often it is, or caregiver. And the crying baby, very realistic for conducting infant studies. And we found very surprisingly that yes, babies did show the same pattern. They did learn horizontal first, which kind of could suggest that they're learning in the same way as the robot did through reinforcement learning. So that was super exciting. It was even more exciting because I had pre-registered it. It made me feel like an absolute magician. I was like, I don't know if anyone else has had a study with that they've pre-registered that has actually come out how you expected it to, but it feels pretty cool. So I was really excited about that. That was the first time that had happened. So yeah, that was pretty exciting and it felt good. And also the 3 results together, even though I had all these null results, all these non-replications, together the story kind of, it made sense, because every time I tried to replicate a study that kind of assumed this high level understanding in infants, I wasn't able to. And then as soon as I do a study that's trying to say, no, babies aren't as clever as we think they are, then I'm magically able to get the result I predicted. So yeah, that kind of was the framing for my PhD in the end. But along the PhD, I had several side quests. So one of the side quests was Many Babies. So Many Babies is a big team science project for replication and best practices in developmental psychology research. And so basically Many Babies 1 was conveniently about a topic that was very relevant to my PhD. So do infants actually prefer infant-directed speech, which is a very like kind of, they wanted to start with something that is quite well corroborated in the literature already, but they kind of wanted to look at the variability of this. And so this was super relevant to what I had a high vested interest in wanting to know the answer to this. And they found essentially, yes, infants do prefer infant-directed speech with a lot of caveats. And caveats that kind of also made sense with my interpretation of everything, because it was like, you know, this was variable. It got more over time as the infants got older, which could suggest like that input is important rather than like some innate like magic thing about infant-directed speech. And also that it was like variable across the world, like in countries that matched the stimuli, which were in American English, it was higher than in other countries and things like that. So that was really interesting. But the part that I was actually involved in was the retest reliability part, which was basically looking at like, if you take one infant, well, not one infant, but basically does the same infant show the same level of preference if they're tested on different occasions? Is this something that is like an individual differences thing, or is it just like, is there too much variability to look at this in an individual differences way? And we found that the retest reliability was quite low. It did increase with number of trials, but as you can expect with infants, higher number of trials, higher dropout as well. And we kind of concluded from this that not all experimental measures, especially with infants, can be used to look at individual differences. So that was interesting as well. So then I had a second side quest. So after all of this, I was kind of like, I had all of these things that I'd learned about like open science and all these things that I wished I'd known at the beginning of my PhD. And so basically with some great co-authors, we wrote a guide for graduate students and their advisors on how to ease into open science. So we looked at the what, the why, the how, and the worries of a range of different open science practices. So getting involved in an open science journal club, like the reproducibility journal club that you have here at York, very luckily. How to kind of like change your project workflow to be ready to be open from the outset, how to manage preprints, reproducible code, sharing data, transparent manuscript writing, pre-registration, and registered reports. So this was kind of our like how you could ease into any of these steps as and it was written for PhD students, but kind of would be relevant to anyone getting started in open science. So I was really happy to kind of put everything I'd learned into that paper and feel like it was helping people. So that's pretty exciting. And the reference here is basically that it can be really hard when you are interested in open science, knowing kind of what direction to take, because there's just so many resources out there. So we were trying to kind of make it a bit easier to give at least one path that you could take of many. Okay, so then, well, not after my PhD, I was writing up my PhD and I had the usual panic of like, okay, like my funding is going to run out, how am I going to pay the bills? So I was looking for postdocs, and as many of you have probably experienced, it's quite hard to find relevant postdocs to the stuff that you've been studying, especially if you're not willing to like move across the world necessarily. And so I kind of had the choice of what to do, and I decided to do something completely different. Well, not completely different. So it was still within developmental psychology, and it was in a lab that was very open science focused. So that was kind of the connection for me. But it was a completely different topic. So this was a postdoc on the relationship between Lego construction ability, spatial skills, and mathematical ability. So we were looking at the kind of relationships between these at one time point, but also looking at designing a training study where basically we would train kids on how to construct Lego from kind of diagrams and see whether this kind of improved their spatial and math skills. So very different from the stuff that I've been doing with infants. But the bit that was most exciting about this for me was that it was my first registered reports adventure. So registered reports are, if you don't know, are basically where so in a traditional publication process, you do your entire study and then you submit it to a journal and then they say, no, we think there's like this methodological flaw, and you're like, great, but I've spent 3 years on this. So that's not very great to know right now. Whereas with a registered reports, it's kind of flipped. So basically you submit the idea so the introduction and the methods, and you say, hey, what do you think of this to the journal, not in those words. And then it undergoes review. If reviewers and editor agree through like changes that you'll kind of negotiate with them that it's good enough, then they will give it in principle acceptance, which basically means they agree to publish it regardless of what results you get, as long as you did what you said you were going to do. So it's great because then you don't have that situation where you're always like predicting what reviewers will think. It's like, well, why don't you just ask them? Quite quite intuitive. I don't really know why it hasn't been done before, but yeah, it's great that it exists now. So I really wanted to try my first registered report. We thought this made sense for the training study. I just wanted to quickly share a few things that we learned, because I know I think the first registered report is always the hardest, and then after that you kind of have learned a lot. So hopefully I can share a bit of that with you. So I'd really recommend using the Centre for Open Science registered report resources, including they have a really great checklist. You can look at whether a journal that you're interested in even offers them. There's a great list that has all the kind of different journals, but also caveats of in what context they'll accept them, etc. Making sure that you check the specific journal requirements for the journal that you're thinking of submitting to. And we emailed the registered reports editor about both scope and timeline to kind of make sure that we weren't putting in loads of effort when it wasn't going to make sense for our project. And all of this worked. So we received in principle acceptance at developmental science, which was really great. But there were also a lot of hard parts and things that we learned, so I'll share that as well. So in this case, originally in the grant, it had been proposed that we do this study looking at the associations, which would then inform the training study. But we hadn't done that study yet, so it was a bit weird to do the training study without having that information. So it was a bit hard to time everything. It probably wasn't the best fit in that way. I was just too excited and wanted to do it. Review can also take a really long time. I can't remember the exact timing, but I think you can imagine how long a review takes normally and assume it's pretty much the same. But something that can really help with that is scheduled review, which some journals do offer, and also PCI registered reports, which I'm happy to talk more about in the Q&A, which isn't a journal, but connects with journals. They have scheduled review, which basically means that you say, I'm going to submit my stage 1 proposal on this date, and then they line up the reviewers in advance ready to review it within a week. Really cool. So yeah, I would definitely recommend that if you're worried about the timeline thing. And they have a lot of journals affiliated with them, so lots of options depending on what field you're in. The other thing we learned is that you can actually make changes after you've received in principle acceptance. It's just that you have to ask the editor. So that's fine. Just make sure that you do ask, because you don't want to get to the stage where you're submitting the final version and then you've made something that you think is a tiny change and the editor's like, well, that's not what you said you were going to do, so we're going to reject the entire paper. So don't do that. We needed to make a change because after piloting our control condition, the kids hated it. So yeah, we needed to change that. We also learned that it's much easier to write a registered report for a hypothesis-driven study, but it's actually not essential. So we actually ended up taking out a lot of the hypotheses that we didn't feel we were behind as much, and having fewer hypotheses and more exploratory stuff in there. And the big take home was that supplementary materials are excellent and your best friend, and basically just put everything in the supplementary. Don't worry about the word count, just word vomit everything that you have in plan for the study, and the reviewers can decide whether or not they can be bothered to read it. So then I also, during this postdoc, had my third side quest. So we created an open research across disciplines document. So basically this had little vignettes of examples of good practice across fields beyond psychology, and resources resources across all the different disciplines listed as well. So you can actually contribute to this. So if you have any resources that you want to contribute, you can just use that link. So an example from chemistry would just look like this, like a little vignette about a paper that did it really well and all the cool things they did, and then listed below just loads of resources. Then, probably a good time for a drink. So then sadly, COVID happened. So in March 2020, like many others, I left my postdoc office and never came back. And I had a decision to make with my PI. So do we kind of try and get creative and pivot everything online and just continue with the postdoc? Or do we just furlough me indefinitely and hope for the best? I was kind of pro first option. PI was kind of pro second option, so we ended up doing second option. So I just used my furlough time pretending to learn how to run. Didn't go very well. Baking, doing loads of research side projects, reflecting on myself as a human, and ultimately applying for other jobs because I hate uncertainty, and it was not fun kind of constantly not knowing when I was going to be back, even though it was very much fun getting paid not to do my job. But yeah, the other part was not fun. So my excellent friend and mentor, Christina Bergman, sent me a job advert that was very much outside of what I would normally think about, which was a community manager role, already curveball there. And then for the journal editors discussion interface, which I'll explain a bit about in a second. I applied and ultimately got offered it and decided to take it. Yes, I did manage to find an Alice in Wonderland times Star Wars reference image. Proud of myself there. The Journal Editors Discussion Interface, or JEDI, came about from the Data Pass initiative. So this is a group of people who work at different data repositories in the social sciences. And so they work on archiving, cataloging, and preserving data. And they basically wanted to make a link with journal editors to basically, like, it would be bi-directional. So they would be explaining to journal editors what they can offer to journals in terms of data management, etc. And journal editors could also tell them what would be useful to them in terms of workflows and things like that. So they held workshops with journal editors and ultimately decided that it would be great to have an online community for them to have this exchange. And they got funding to do so. So the idea is basically that journal editors are gatekeepers in their fields. They have a really important role. We were talking about it in the chat just before this with the kind of smaller chat, how kind of they have so much power and yet there is often so little training on how to do it. We often think of journal editors as these evil people, off with the author's head, said the journal editor, things like that. They have all this power. So can we try and maybe use it for good? So that's what we're trying to do. So essentially we have for JEDI a mailing list and a resource collection, and the two are connected. So the mailing list functions as a Google group. We now have, from zero when I started in Jan 2021, we have now 430 members, which I'm very proud of, who have contributed to almost 200 threads on a wide variety of issues across journal editing. And we also pull out of these conversations any relevant resources that people share and keep them in our JEDI resources collection. So that's a good link to go to if you are an editor and interested in resources that can help you be a better editor. So we've had, over 60 contributors contributing over 300 resources. So very, very proud of that so far. So in terms of the kinds of topics that we cover both on the listserv, we basically held a workshop to cover the ones that were most popular and people wanted to learn more about. You can watch the recordings there if you are a peer review nerd. So we had plenaries on how journal editors can shape incentives for researchers, the pros and cons of open peer review, which is probably one of the openness things, as we were talking about before, that is most kind of contentious, or maybe even people who are very pro open science don't want open peer review, for example. And then we had more specific sessions, training people on editors on what they could do around computational reproducibility, diversity in journal editing, incentivizing reviews, choosing data repositories, and working with preprints and pre-registration and registered reports. And so then off the back of this, we're also working on a paper. So this is basically the guide that I was talking about before that we made for PhD students. We want to do it again, but for journal editors. So this time it's not on like what they can do as individual researchers to ease into open science, but it's on what they can do to ease into open science policies and practices at their journals instead, but using the same format of like what, why, how, worries. And so we started this paper with a hackathon at the SIPS conference, which I would massively recommend if you're an open science nerd but haven't yet been. And so we basically just got loads of people in a room who cared about this stuff and wrote a paper. So we, in the actual meeting, I think there were only maybe like 15 of us there. And we knocked out 14,000 words. Very proud of that. So now my job is to make that paper. So we're working on that now, on finalizing that and submitting it to research integrity and peer review, which I'm really excited about. So if you're a journal editor, feel free to read the draft and contribute via that link. But because, you know, this was a part-time job and also I like variety, I thought maybe there's time for another adventure as well. Community management was very fun and very in line with my mission of like, yeah, just open science advocacy, etc. But I really did miss research. I just love research, so I did miss that part of it. And so I'd previously been in conversation with the Centre for Open Science about a job that I didn't end up getting, but I was really happy with the conversations that were happening there. And so I just reached out to them by email to say, you know, are there any other opportunities on the same project for part-time work? And they were just like, yeah. So then I got another role on the Systematizing Confidence in Open Research and Evidence SCORE project, which I will talk about a bit now. So the SCORE project basically is an absolutely massive project, looking at whether we can create rapid, scalable, valid methods for assessing confidence in research claims. So can we basically take a claim in a paper and say how much confidence we have about that claim being true? And true can mean a variety of things. It can mean, would it replicate? It could mean, would it reproduce? Like, could you reproduce the same result with the materials from the original study? It could mean, would it generalize? It could mean, how robust is it to like slightly different statistical analyses, etc. So confidence is doing a lot of work here, but yeah, that's kind of the scope of what we're looking at. But first I'll kind of like back up and explain what we mean by a claim. So like, we think like papers are just like a bunch of text, but within that, hopefully there are like actual things being claimed in them. Usually. So that a claim can be thought of as like a claim trace that runs through the entire paper. So the title will often like make a claim, but then you can usually trace that to like a sentence in the abstract. You can usually trace that to a hypothesis or a finding, and then the actual statistical evidence that corresponds to that. So we basically extracted claims from papers based on this logic. But papers don't usually only have one claim. So for a subset of them, we also did this bushel trace thing, which was really cool, which was basically looking at extracting the claims, not only one claim per paper, but extracting all the important claims in a paper. So you can imagine like the title should kind of summarize everything, but then you might have a sentence in the abstract that then is like, has 3 sub-hypotheses that then each have like loads of statistical evidence, especially in these papers that have like loads of robustness tests or something like that. So you kind of look at how all these things connect together and the map of all the claims in the paper, which I really enjoyed working. It was really difficult, but I enjoyed working out how it would do that. So the SCORE project is, like I said, it's massive. So I was only working on this TA1 bit at the top. So the claims, which I talked about, so extracting the claims from the papers. So we extracted claims from almost 4,000 papers. And then also kind of managing the replication data. So for around 600 of these, we conducted replications and reproductions. We didn't, but we kind of managed people conducting these, which is like very massive if you think about like even like big things like, what's it called? Like it slipped out of my mind the name for the paper that like originally showed that like we have a replication crisis in psychology, but yeah, reproducibility project psychology or something like that. Yeah, but that 600 is a lot more. And also we're doing it across all the social behavioral sciences, not just psychology. So this is like a big project. So then, as well as conducting those replications and reproductions, we also are looking at human predictions. So basically, how good are humans at predicting which of these studies will replicate? And then we're also looking at the machine learning, like the AI predictions of it as well. So how good are the algorithms at predicting both which studies will replicate, but also at predicting what the humans will predict. So it's all connected, but we're also, the ultimate aim is basically like, if this works, then you could, rather than having to replicate something like I did, every time you want to know whether a claim is like, that you can have confidence in a claim, you could at least have some sort of idea of whether something was maybe even like worth replicating in the first place because you're not very sure versus something that you can be very sure in. So that's the kind of big idea behind the project. So results pending from that. But this consultant life doing these two jobs was a little bit lonely. I really missed having a lab. So I just decided to start my own. So I created Nowhere Lab. So in Nowhere Lab, anyone from any field is welcome to join who doesn't have a lab but would like the lab meeting experience. So who's the kind of people that join Nowhere Lab? Well, we have like new faculty who have no one in their lab yet. Maybe they won't have any students until they get a grant, and they haven't got a grant yet. They can join. Ex-academics who now work in industry, or maybe people who were never academics at all and they just are curious. Freelancers, maybe science communicators, other consultants like I was. We have a lot of keen master students, also open to undergrads, etc. People who have a lab but for some reason or another don't feel comfortable there and therefore want a nicer one. People who are between jobs, you know, maybe people finishing off PhDs in their writing year and they kind of don't feel like they can still be in their old lab but don't have a new one, etc. But yeah, we don't vet your reasons. If you need us, we're here. So far we have 145 members of our Slack. We have about 5 to 10 attendees at our weekly lab meetings. Currently Mondays 1 to 2, if you're interested in attending. We have recently partnered with Fort, which is great to kind of like, I don't know if you know about Fort, but yeah, basically they are a great open science organization as well. So we've partnered with them. I was interviewed with one of our members, NAA Egba, for the reproducibility podcast, if you want to learn a little bit more about it. So what do our meetings really look like? So this is one of the options. So someone will say, I have this idea for a study, but I'm not sure. What do you all think? So we do this with the CRIC format, which if you want to know more about, you can go here to that link, which essentially is like, it's from like in business, you have like pre-mortems for ideas, which is basically where you like critique it before it's happened and say why it might affect, why this project could fail so that you can fix things before it's too late. So we have those sessions where people come with study ideas and then we rip them apart in a very kind way and help them. We often have journal clubs, often open science related. People can practice talks. I actually practiced this talk yesterday. And we often have discussions about things like the two-body problem in academia, or like generally like academia versus industry, or like how to improve your mental health while you're doing a PhD, etc. We sometimes have hackathons where we try to like create something together, writing sessions, keep holding each other accountable, interview prep. I think we've had like at least 3 successful jobs come out of people doing their interview prep, obviously correlation, not causation, but you know. And then, you know, we often have like just fun times as well with parties and games. One of the things we created in a hackathon was this PhD survival guide, just in case there's any PhD students trying to survive in this audience. That includes things like what's great about doing a PhD, what's not so great, top tips, how not to handle stress, etc. So if you're interested in that, that could be useful. You know, these contracts are due to finish this Jan. I had the usual panic again of how am I going to pay the bills, especially now. So the panic was just beginning to creep in when I saw an advert for a job with the Psychological Science Accelerator. So for those of you who were at last year's talk, you might remember that the PSA is basically a globally distributed network of labs with over 1,000 members representing 84 countries that coordinates data collection for democratically selected studies. So essentially it's a big team science project where people pool their resources to do studies in psychology. Very cool. So I got the job, yay. And so what am I going to be studying come January? So essentially the idea is that in psychological science, we want to understand humans, we want to understand the mental life of humans, and we've done a great job. We've found a lot of cool things, but most of the advancements that we've made, we've been studying a really small slice of humanity. There's different ways of describing the people that we've studied. One of them is weird, so Western, educated, from industrial, rich and democratic countries. And we don't know whether this subset of people differs from humanity as a whole. And so we don't know whether our answers to these big questions that we frame in our papers, including myself, as universal, may not reliably generalize. So in my PhD studies, I'm talking about how do babies learn that someone is communicating to them? That's a pretty big question. But if everyone I've studied has been such a specific population, which they are, then how do I know that that answer is the same across the world? So the idea in this project is to select and carry out 4 global studies with participants across the world, but in both university samples and community samples, to see whether these 2 different types of generalizability are different. There could be some things that are common across university students everywhere, but not these community samples, or it could be more country specific, and whether it's a university sample or community sample doesn't matter as much. So that's what we're going to be looking at. And then the bit that I'm super excited about, not that I'm not excited about that, is we're also going to be surveying researchers to estimate. So how in the SCORE project, we're getting people to predict whether things will replicate or not. In this project, we're looking at whether they can predict whether things will generalize or not. So we're going to be looking at how accurate are researchers at predicting the actual results that we get about generalizability, but also whether different characteristics of researchers predict their accuracy. And also how this varies over time. So because we're doing these 4 studies, we're staggering them, so people will have access to results of some before they do their next predictions. So does accuracy and intellectual humility vary across the 4 waves of the project we're also going to be looking at? But when I was offered the job, I had kind of mixed feelings about it. For those who are chronically online, like myself, you may have seen a lot of discussion about the value of postdocs and whether we're kind of being exploited. And also especially are they worth it if you're not sure whether or not you want to stay in academia? That's been a lot of the discussion as well. So for me, I'm trying to just see it as one of many job options. In this case, there were so many perks associated with it that I thought it was worth it to go back to academia. So my supervisor is letting me be 100% remote from the UK, even though it's a US job. Lots of other perks, loads of holiday, and just generally being nice, letting me work on loads of side projects, just generally seeming great. So for me, it was an easy decision to say yes. But after this, who knows? A lot of options. Maybe Revolution could reform academia in a way in which I would feel comfortable returning for good. Maybe I'll want to work in another nonprofit like the Centre for Open Science. Maybe I'll find a non-evil corporation to work for. Maybe continue open science advocacy or policy work. Maybe I'll get bored of research. I think that's less likely. Or most likely, probably something else that I can't even imagine yet. So not sure which cookies to eat or what will happen when I eat them, but excited to see. Yeah, to be continued. So I will, so once you get access to the slides, there's lots of fun resources for you. And now I think we can just have Q&A. Thanks for listening.